Hi, everybody. Welcome back. I hope you all had a wonderful, relaxing, restful holiday break with your families and that you feel ready to take on term 4. Thank you so much for joining me for our brand new writing program this term. We have a different focus this term. Last term we focused on informative writing, and this term we're going to focus on something a little different. Before we go into our lesson, let's look at what we're going to be doing this week. So Monday was a public holiday, so there were no lessons. Today is Tuesday, so this is lesson 1, and we will be looking at imaginative writing. Then on Wednesday for lesson 2, we'll be looking at imaginative writing again. And on Thursday for lesson 3, we will be looking at a persuasive response. Then on Friday, it's your catch-up day, so there are no writing lessons. Let's have a look at our learning intention and success criteria before we begin. So our learning intention says, we are learning to identify the parts of an imaginative text. So an imaginative text is different to an informative text. If you remember last term, our informative texts were based on facts, things that were true. But now we are looking at imaginative text, which means we're focusing on things that might not be true and might come from someone's or your imagination. Our success criteria says, I can identify the 4 steps to a successful story. So we begin with a very important step called the ooh, and I'll explain a bit more about that later. The next step is the ah. The next one is uh-oh, there's a problem. And the last one is phew, relief. So this is the structure that we are going to be using to put imaginative stories together when we write them. But first, today our focus is going to be on looking at other imaginative stories and thinking about imaginative stories that we might already know and having a think about whether they take this structure with the ooh, ah, uh-oh, and phew. A really good example of an imaginative text is a fairy tale. Now, I'm sure we've all heard a few fairy tales. So if you have a think, maybe you can think of some fairy tales that you have heard and what makes it a good story. And what are your favourite stories or fairy tales that you can think of? And we've got a couple of clues on our slide today. To the right, we can see Mr. Gingerbread Man, and he is from the fairy tale, The Gingerbread Man. And to the left, we can see Little Red Riding Hood. She is from the fairy tale called Little Red Riding Hood. Now, you might be able to think of some other fairy tales like Cinderella or Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. You might have some other ideas. What we're going to do today is have a look at a fairy tale. So on the next slide, you are going to see a video of Little Red Riding Hood. And as you watch, I want you to think of some things. I want you to think of the characters that are in the story. I'd like you to think of the setting, so where the story is happening. And you need to also think about the problem in the story and how the problem is solved. Now let's watch Little Red Riding Hood.
Gigabox!
This is the story of Little Red Riding Hood. Once upon a time, there was a little girl who lived in a village near a big forest. Her grandmother had made her a beautiful red cloak with a big red hood, which she wore every time she went outside. And so everyone in the village called her Little Red Riding Hood. One day, Little Red Riding Hood's mother said,
Grandma isn't feeling very well. Will you take this basket of food through the forest to her cottage?
Yes, Mother.
said Little Red Riding Hood.
I sure would love to see Grandma.
She put on her red cloak and she pulled up her red hood and she took the basket of food into the forest.
Remember,
Her mother called after her.
don't talk to any strangers along the way.
I won't.
Little Red Riding Hood promised, and she skipped down the path and into the woods. Little Red Riding Hood did not have to worry about getting lost in the forest because she knew the way to Grandma's house very well. But along the way, she saw some beautiful wild flowers growing near the path.
I bet Grandma would really love these.
She said to herself, and she stopped to pick a few.
Hello, little girl,
Said a deep, growling voice from behind her. Little Red Riding Hood was very startled. She spun around and saw a big bad wolf standing in the shadows between two trees.
Hello.
Said Little Red Riding Hood. She didn't know that the wolf was bad, and she had already forgotten her mother's words about talking to strangers.
Where are you going on this fine day?
Asked the big bad wolf.
I'm going to my grandma's cottage on the other side of the forest.
Said Little Red Riding Hood.
She isn't feeling very well, so I'm bringing her this basket of food and these flowers.
What a sweet girl you are.
Said the big bad wolf. He smiled and showed his mouthful of sharp teeth. The big bad wolf was quite hungry, and he was not interested in the basket of food.
I had better be going.
Said Little Red Riding Hood.
Bye.
And she skipped off down the path. The big bad wolf's stomach grumbled and growled with hunger, and suddenly he had an idea. As quick as he could, he ran through the forest all the way to Grandma's cottage. The sneaky wolf opened the door very quietly and found Grandma asleep in her bed. He picked up the old woman, opened his great big mouth, and he swallowed poor Grandma in one gulp. Then the big bad wolf climbed into the bed and pulled the blanket up to his chin. He put on Grandma's glasses and her nightcap, and he waited for the little girl to arrive with her flowers and basket of food. When Little Red Riding Hood arrived at the cottage, she opened the door quietly and found Grandma lying in bed.
Hello, Grandma.
She said,
Mother told me you weren't feeling well, so I brought some food and some flowers. Do you like them?
What a sweet little girl you are.
said the wolf in his fake grandma voice.
Come closer, my dear.
Little Red Riding Hood took a step closer, and she noticed that something looked a little different about Grandma.
My,
She said,
what big eyes you have, Grandma.
All the better to see you with.
said the big bad wolf.
Come closer, my dear.
Little Red Riding Hood took another step closer to the bed.
My,
She said,
what big ears you have, Grandma.
All the better to hear you with.
replied the wolf.
Come closer, my dear.
Little Red Riding Hood took one more step closer.
My, what big teeth you have, Grandma.
She said in surprise.
All the better to eat you with.
Growled the big bad wolf. He jumped out of the bed, and as he opened his great big mouth, Little Red Riding Hood shrieked and tried to run, but the hungry wolf grabbed her up and swallowed Little Red Riding Hood in just one gulp. Outside the cottage, a woodsman happened to be walking through the forest when he heard Little Red Riding Hood's shriek of surprise. He hurried inside and he saw the wolf with his huge round belly. The woodsman grabbed the big bad wolf, turned him upside down and shook him by his feet. Little Red Riding Hood came tumbling out of the wolf's mouth, and Grandma followed. The three of them chased the big bad wolf out of the cottage, out of the forest and over the hill. The big bad wolf ran for his life and was never seen again. Little Red Riding Hood learned her lesson, and she never, ever talked to strangers again. The end.
Remember to please like the video and subscribe to our channel so you can stay updated on all our new videos.
I hope you all enjoyed watching Little Red Riding Hood. Now, I know a lot of you would have already seen Little Red Riding Hood or read a book about Little Red Riding Hood before. So it's a story that a lot of us already know and are already familiar with, but it's always enjoyable to watch. So let's think about that for a moment. Why are fairy tales and good stories always exciting and entertaining? It's because they have these 4 steps to a successful story. So you might remember from our learning intention slide at the beginning of this lesson, I mentioned some interesting new words, ooh, ah, uh-oh, and phew. And you might have been thinking, oh my goodness, what are those crazy words that Mrs. James is talking about? Well, let's have a look at it here. The first one, ooh, is the interesting characters. So all the interesting characters that you might see in a good story or fairy tale. The R is the descriptive setting. So the setting is where the story has been set or where it is happening, the location, the place where the story is happening. The uh-oh is the exciting problem that happens in the story. So a reason why we are so entertained by these stories is because they usually have an exciting problem. And the last one is phew. That's when the problem is solved. The problem is fixed at the end of the story and we go away happy. So if we think about the story of Little Red Riding Hood, some interesting characters there were Little Red Riding Hood, Grandma, and the Big Bad Wolf. The Big Bad Wolf was particularly interesting, wasn't he? Because he was so scary and evil. And the setting was the forest or the woods that Little Red Riding Hood was living in and where she walked through to get to Grandma's house. And it was quite scary in that forest, wasn't it? That's where she came across the big bad wolf. And the exciting problem that we had in the story was her encounter with the big bad wolf and the mean things that the big bad wolf did to her and to Grandma. And then at the end, the phew, when the problem was solved, was when the woodcutter came in and rescued Grandma from the big bad wolf's belly, and everyone was happy at the end of the story. Let's start thinking about the 4 steps to a successful story in a bit more detail. So we'll start with the ooh, which is the interesting characters. We'll just go through a few examples on this screen of some interesting characters that maybe you've already seen in some stories you've read or that you might think of when writing your own story. So we might have a knight in shining armor. Why is the knight interesting? Well, maybe he might help to rescue someone or solve a problem. We might have a very funny clown character that does silly things. We might have a superhero that comes to help solve the problem. We might have a funny purple furry monster. We might have a circus, and there might be circus characters like a ringleader and a lion at the circus that might be performing some interesting tricks in the story. So these are just some ideas of interesting characters that we might come across in stories or that you might use to help you come up with your own characters when you're writing a story. Let's have a look at the next step to a successful story, which is the R, and that's the descriptive settings, the places where stories might be happening. So we've got a range of different settings here. We've got the beach, looks like a beautiful tropical island there. We've got outer space. Wow, imagine all the interesting things that could happen if a story was set in outer space. We've got an under the sea setting. That kind of reminds me of a fairy tale like The Little Mermaid, things that happen under the sea. We might have a beautiful fairy tale castle. Maybe a king and a queen live there, or a princess. We might also have a beanstalk. That one reminds me of the fairy tale Jack and the Beanstalk, which you might have read before. Or we might even have a scary haunted house where some spooky things happen in the story. So these are just some examples of some descriptive settings that maybe you have already seen in stories or that you might use as ideas for your own stories. Let's have a look now at the uh-oh, which is the exciting problem. So remember, a problem is something that happens in the story that might be bad, or it might make someone upset in the story and they need to try and solve the problem. Ooh, this boy looks like he's been wrapped up in rope. He looks trapped to me. Maybe someone has trapped him and he needs to try and get out. This girl looks very frightened of a spider. Maybe she entered a haunted house and saw some spooky things in there. We've got a witch here with a cauldron. So maybe there's an evil character in your story that is doing some nasty things to people. So this witch looks like they might be concocting a bit of a spell to cast on somebody. You might have the big bad wolf. And like we saw in the Little Red Riding Hood story, the big bad wolf was the character that ate Grandma and caused all the problems for Little Red Riding Hood. So these are just some examples of some characters or things that might happen to cause a problem in a story. And you might have already seen characters or problems like this in stories you've read, or you could use them as ideas for your own stories. Finally, we come to the final step to a successful story, which is phew, when the problem is solved. So you might see a superhero who has come to rescue people or solve the problem. You might see people making up after an argument they've had and they are friends again. Or you might see someone rescuing an animal like this fireman who's rescuing a cat from a tree. You may have seen solutions to problems in stories like this already, or you could use them as ideas for your own stories. What you need to do now is think about your own favourite fairy tale. So today we watched a video of Little Red Riding Hood, but there are so many other fairy tales that you have probably read in a book or seen on TV or at the movies that you might be able to think of. And you might have a favourite one. So in your week 1 completed work doc, could you write down the name of your favourite fairy tale? If you like, you might like to draw a picture of it as well and put it in your completed work doc too. But I really would just like to see a name of a fairy tale, just to show that you have started thinking about fairy tales. So some examples might include Cinderella, Little Red Riding Hood, The Three Little Pigs, The Three Billy Goats Gruff, The Gingerbread Man, Rapunzel, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, Goldilocks and the Three Bears, or The Princess and the Pea. And there are so many other fairy tales that you might be able to think of as well. So just pick one, write down the name of it in your completed work doc, and you can draw a picture of it too if you like. That concludes our lesson for today. Let's go through our learning intention and success criteria to make sure we have learnt about everything we needed to do. So, our learning intention said we are learning to identify the parts of an imaginative text. We did. We talked about the 4 steps to a successful story. A success criteria says I can identify the 4 steps to a successful story, which are ooh, ah, uh-oh, and phew. And because we've done that now in this lesson, we can actually say what they are. So the ooh is the interesting characters. The ah is the descriptive settings where the story is happening. The uh-oh is the exciting problem that happens. And phew is when the problem is solved. I hope you enjoyed today's lesson about imaginative writing and that you have started to think about some of the things that make a story or a fairy tale successful or entertaining to read. Thank you for joining me today, and I'll see you for tomorrow's lesson. Bye!